What chance did a woman have in a naval courtroom where the very laws were written by men who considered piracy unnatural for her sex? The answer, as history reveals with cruel consistency, was almost none. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the so-called golden age of piracy, the British Admiralty courts treated piracy with absolute severity, but for women, the crime carried a double stain. To be accused of piracy was already a capital offence. To be a woman in a man's world of salt, gunpowder, and blood was to violate not only imperial law, but also deeply entrenched gender expectations. The ocean was imagined as a masculine domain, and a woman's presence aboard ship was often whispered about as bad luck. So, when a woman appeared in the dock accused of piracy, she was viewed as doubly transgressive, a disruption of the social order itself. Trials for piracy did not resemble the familiar courtroom dramas of today. They were often held in makeshift tribunals, convened by naval officers in colonial ports like Jamaica or New Providence. These Admiralty courts operated without juries. Guilt was usually assumed from the start. The proceedings were swift, but never without their grim theatrics. Captains, naval officers, and even frightened sailors were called to testify, often eager to distance themselves from any suspicion of sympathy toward piracy. The accused women had little chance to mount a defense. Their voices carried little weight in courtrooms already hostile to their very presence. Yet even in this hopeless arena, some women fought back with words sharper than swords. In 1720, two of the most infamous female pirates, Bonny and Mary Read, stood trial in Spanish Town, Jamaica, alongside their lover and comrade, Calico Jack Rackham. The transcripts of their trial are among the rare surviving records of female piracy, and they reveal a defiance that echoes across the centuries. When Rackham was condemned to death, Bonny's bitter farewell cut deeper than any blade. "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." In that moment, her words transformed the courtroom into a theatre of defiance, as though she was less a criminal and more a tragic heroine. But rhetoric could not save them. Only biology offered a slim hope. The one defense available to condemned women was known as pleading the belly. If a woman could prove she was pregnant, her execution was temporarily delayed. For Bonny and Read, this strategy worked, at least for a time. It was a cruel irony. Life within them became their only shield against death outside. Yet history shows that most female pirates were not so fortunate. Without pregnancy to save them, their fates were sealed long before they entered the courtroom. For those condemned, the path to death was ritualized and cruel. Execution was not merely punishment, it was spectacle, a deliberate performance staged to terrify all who might be tempted by the lure of piracy. The Piracy Act of 1698, passed under King William III, made it explicit. All and every person so offending shall suffer pains of death. The Admiralty chose London's execution dock as the theatre for this grim finale. There, where the Thames tide ebbed and flowed, pirates were executed with the very waters that had once carried their freedom lapping at their feet. The journey to the gallows was itself part of the punishment. Prisoners were led from Newgate Prison in a slow, humiliating procession paraded in carts through London's jeering crowds. By the time they reached Wapping, the site of execution dock, the condemned were already broken by shame and fear. The gallows awaited, looming like a skeletal sentinel over the river. Unlike land-based hangings, which used a long drop to ensure swift death, Admiralty executions employed the short drop. This meant strangulation rather than a clean break of the neck. The victim convulsed violently in what was grimly known as the marshal's dance limbs, jerking and twisting as life slowly drained away. The crowd played its role with relish. To the Empire, these executions were moral theatre, a public warning staged on the threshold between land and sea. The message was unmistakable. Piracy would not be forgiven, regardless of gender. Bodies were sometimes left hanging until three tides had washed over them, their corpses swaying grotesquely above the Thames. The practice of gibbeting, leaving the remains on display in iron cages, was more common for male pirates, but the very threat of such a fate was enough to strip away whatever romance lingered in the pirate's image. And yet, even among these grim rituals, the rare women who stood at the gallows carried a unique kind of notoriety. Mary Critchett, an American woman who joined a band of escaped convicts turned pirates in 1729, was captured near Virginia. Her trial was brief, her sentence inevitable. Unlike Bonny or Reed, she had no pregnancy to plead, no allies to fight for her. She was executed swiftly and without fanfare. History preserved her name but little else, as if to remind us that for most women who dared to seize the freedom of the seas, the empire responded with silence as much as with rope. The contrast between the freedom of piracy and the terror of the gallows could not have been more stark. On deck, a woman like Anne Bonny might command fear and respect, pistols at her side, eyes hardened by salt and fire. But in the courtroom or beneath the hangman's noose, she was reduced to a lesson, her individuality erased and replaced with a symbol of imperial control. Her death, like the deaths of so many, was meant not to close her story, but to reinforce the power of empire over sea, over body, and over memory itself. For some captured women of the sea, the gallows was not their first torment. Before the rope, many felt the sting of the whip. Flogging was one of the most common punishments meted out by naval authorities and colonial governors, and it was as much about spectacle as it was about pain. The instrument of choice was the dreaded cat-o'-nine-tails, a whip with multiple knotted cords, each lash tearing into flesh with merciless precision. For men, flogging was already a brutal ordeal, but when a woman was bound to the post, stripped before jeering crowds, the punishment became layered with humiliation. The empire demanded not only her suffering but her degradation, as if to prove that her defiance had been crushed in both body and spirit. Sentences varied widely, sometimes 12 lashes, other times more than 100, but each blow was designed to leave scars that told a story of obedience enforced by violence. Crowds gathered at docksides and prison yards to watch, bringing wives, children, and neighbors as if it were theater. A female pirate's cries mixed with the salt wind, her blood dripping onto cobblestones, and the lesson was etched into every witness. Women who defied their roles would be broken in the most public way possible. Even before their trials, captured pirates like Anne Bonny and Mary Read were reported to have endured deplorable conditions in Jamaican prisons, starvation, filth, and harsh treatment designed to break them down. While direct evidence of flogging against them is scarce, other women in colonial prisons were flogged routinely, not only as punishment, but to extract confessions. Yet not every captured woman met her end at the gallows or beneath the whip. For many, the punishment was more insidious, erasure into slavery, concubinage, or coerced labor. In the Caribbean, West Africa, and across Spanish and Portuguese colonies, the blurred lines between piracy, privateering, and slavery meant that women aboard captured ships were often processed as spoils of war. Archival records from Cartagena and Portobello describe women taken from pirate vessels and sold into bondage without distinction: crew, captives, or consorts, all treated alike. Those of African or indigenous descent were particularly vulnerable, absorbed into plantation economies, or kept as domestic servants in colonial households. In these cases, their identities as pirates vanished completely. They were stripped not only of freedom but of history itself. The cruelty lay not just in the physical bondage, but in the quiet obliteration of their stories. Where male pirates might be hanged and remembered gibbets left swaying, as grim warnings women vanished into silence. They became invisible within plantation records, erased into anonymity. For many, capture meant not a swift death, but a long-living one, marked by servitude and exploitation. Others, though, faced an even darker fate. As prison populations swelled in the 18th century, Britain and its colonies turned to a new kind of punishment: prison hulks. These were rotting, decommissioned warships moored in harbours from Portsmouth to Kingston, Jamaica, their sails stripped, their decks sagging with decay. They were never designed for human confinement, yet they became floating dungeons for rebels, convicts, and pirates, women included. Life aboard these hulks was a slow death sentence. The holds below deck were dark, airless, and crowded. Prisoners lay chained together with barely room to move. Disease spread unchecked. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox claimed lives by the dozens. Food was scarce, water foul, and the stench of waste and sickness hung in the air like a curse. For women, the horror was doubled, not only starvation and illness, but also the constant threat of exploitation by guards or sailors. The records rarely mention these women by name. Their suffering existed in the silences between official reports. And in those silences, history allowed them to vanish. The cruelest irony of all was that these punishments, flogging, enslavement, slow decay aboard prison hulks, were not just about law. They were about power, about an empire terrified of women who dared to live beyond its boundaries. Female pirates embodied rebellion twice over, against the state and against gender. Their erasure, whether through rope, whip, chain, or silence, was designed to restore order by obliterating their memory. Yet fragments of their stories survive. In the defiance of Bonny's words, in the brief record of Mary Critchett's execution, in the anonymous mentions of women processed as spoils of war, we glimpse the shadows of lives that challenged an empire. They remind us that the ocean, for all its vastness, could not hide them forever from the machinery of justice, but neither could that machinery entirely erase their defiance. History has left us with echoes rather than full voices. We remember the gallows and the whips, but we must also remember the silences, the disappearances, the unnamed, the forgotten. For it is in those silences that the true measure of power is revealed, who is remembered and who is consigned to oblivion. As the Roman historian Tacitus once wrote, the more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws. In the fates of these women, we see not only the weight of law, but the desperation of an empire to control what it feared most, women who refused to be bound by its order.